starts now. Good morning, good morning, good morning, people. You're now listening to the sounds. I'm sorry. Wait a minute. Did Ben freeze? Oh my God.
Oh, boy, I'm about to say at the beginning of the show. At the very beginning of the show, no less. Wow. This internet.
Let's try this again. Good morning, good morning, good morning, people.
Good morning and welcome to Like It or Not, where we're free to tell the truth and not care who doesn't like it. It is Monday, May 17th, 2021. Thanks so much for everyone joining us. James, DJ Exclusive, how's it going, man?
Pretty good, brother. It's a Monday of Mondays.
It is a Monday, and Monday's still Monday, even in this pandemic. But Friday is still Friday, so we're 5 days away from Friday. So we're counting down to Friday. Good morning to everyone in the different chat rooms, Facebook, YouTube, Twitch, Twitter, everywhere you're watching us. Please sure to hit the like, share, and the subscribe button to continue supporting what we're doing here at Like It or Not. I want to begin right away with the conflict, the ongoing conflict that's happening in Israel-Palestine and Gaza. I want to give you an update. And according to CNN, there have been 2 Israeli airstrikes in Gaza, at least killing at least 43 Palestinians, including 8 children. Now, this is in addition to all the previous strikes. This is just an update this morning. This recent strike injured 50 others, most of whom were women and children, early Sunday morning, according to the Palestinian Ministry of Health. With the latest casualties, according to CNN, the death toll in Gaza has climbed to a total of 197 people, including at least 58 children and 34 women, according to the Palestinian Ministry of Health. Since the beginning of the Israeli airstrikes on Gaza this week, at least 1,235 Palestinians have been injured. Now, last week, members of the squad, that would be AOC, Ayanna Pressley, and Ilhan Omar, and Rashida Tlaib, they spoke. And I want to play a short compilation that was put together by AJ Plus that gives you a good snapshot of how things have changed with regards to sitting members of Congress speaking out vocally about what's happening. Let's take a listen in.
The United States must acknowledge its role in the injustice and human rights violations of Palestinians. This is not about both sides. This is about an imbalance of power.
As a black woman in America, I am no stranger to police brutality and state-sanctioned violence. We have been criminalized for the very way we show up in the world. Last summer, when Black Lives Matter protesters took to the streets to demand justice, they were met with force. They faced tear gas, rubber bullets, and a militarized police, just as our Palestinian brothers and sisters are facing in Jerusalem today. Palestinians are being told the same thing as black folks in America. There is no acceptable form of resistance. We are bearing witness to egregious human rights violations. The pain, trauma, and terror that Palestinians are facing is not just the result of this week's escalation, but the consequence of years of military occupation.
Our St. Louis community sent me here to save lives. That means we oppose our money going to fund militarized policing, occupation, and systems of violent oppression and trauma. We are anti-war, we are anti-occupation, and we are anti-apartheid, period. If this body is looking for something productive to do with $3 million, instead of funding a military that polices and kills Palestinians, I have some communities in St. Louis City and in St. Louis County where that money can go, where we desperately need investment, where we are hurting, where we need help. Let us prioritize funding there. Prioritize funding life, not destruction.
The president and many other figures this week stated that Israel has a right to self-defense, and this is a sentiment that is echoed across this body. But do Palestinians have a right to survive? Do we believe that? And if so, we have a responsibility to that as well.
Do Palestinians also have the right to survive? Now, while many of the newest members of Congress have made their stand with and for the Palestinian people, New York Representative Richie Torres, a Democrat serving his first term in Congress, wrote an op-ed in the New York Times and the New York Post in support of Israel. He also took to the House floor, and I want us to play, it's about 2 minutes of what he had to say in the opposite direction of the argument that was being made by the squad.
Early in the week, a public official posted on Twitter the following image of a map where the state of Israel is nowhere to be found. There is nothing accidental about the omission. Wiping Israel off the map is the objective of the BDS movement. Notice the image includes flowers to symbolize peace, as though peace meant the destruction of Israel itself. When most Americans speak of peace, we mean the peaceful coexistence of an Israeli state and a Palestinian state, not the existence of one to the exclusion of the other. Most Americans are anguished by the trauma of Israelis seeking refuge in bomb shelters in the face of relentless rocket fire. And most Americans are anguished by the deep suffering and death toll of Palestinians who live under the repressive rule of Hamas and who have fallen victim to the wretchedness of war. The rapid-fire rhetoric that we have seen directed at Israel is so hyperbolic, so vitriolic, that it inflames rather than informs. It delegitimizes Israel rather than de-escalates the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Those propagating hate are not part of the solution, but part of the problem. Hate never brings peace. It never has, it never will. You can either promote hate or you can promote peace, but you cannot advance both. Let us not be fooled by the pretense of peace. Let us find the wisdom to tell the difference between genuine peace and hate hidden under the guise of peace. I yield back.
Now, what I find fascinating about his argument is the fact that he deflected from the actual conflict that's happening right now and made the argument over BDS, the boycott, divest, and sanction movement. Instead of focusing on the actual conflict that is happening, this new representative, Richie Torres, decided to find a way to have an argument that could give him good standing with his supporters. He's got to do what he's got to do. But he's doing it in bad faith because the nature of the conflict right now is not over the question of the validity or the root or the causes of BDS and the desires of BDS. It has everything to do with the humanity of the people who are being killed right now, the children who are being killed right now. But he decided to use his time on the floor to deflect. Now, one overlooked or really skimmed over part of this entire conversation is something that Rashida Tlaib took the time to break down, which is the Nakba, where more than 700,000 Palestinian Arabs, about half of pre-war Palestinian Arab population, fled or were expelled from their homes during the 1948 Palestinian War. Now, AJ Plus again put out this clip of Representative Tlaib, the only current Palestinian American member of the House of Representatives, as she explained what that was and put it in context of the current ongoing conflict. Let's take a listen in.
As we talk about our history, know that many of my neighbors in Detroit and beyond may not know what we mean by Nakba, but they do understand to be killed, expelled from your home and land, and stripped of your human rights. My ancestors and current family in Palestine deserve their history to be told without any obstruction or lies. They have a right to be able to explain to the world that they are still suffering from Nakba when the world watched with no intervention. The land confiscations, home demolitions, expulsions are just part of the painful journey of the Palestinian people. The dehumanization and feeling less than on your own homeland is traumatic and can be seen in Palestinian children being raised under this unimaginable condition. As a Palestinian American in Congress, I have been told by some colleagues who disagree with my fact-based truth about segregation, racism, and violence in Israel towards Palestinians. They continue to tell me, quote, directly, I need to know the history, they would say to me. What they mean, unintentionally or not, is that the history of the creation of Israel being told to one generation to another erases the truth about the Nakba.
Now, last week during one of our after shows, I played a portion of a clip from one of our friends of the show, the late Michael Brooks, who passed away last year far too soon, as he explained his perspective on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I wanted to play a little bit more of that here so that you can hear from his perspective, his insights into what was happening. This is from a clip where he spoke at the Lafayette College in February of 2020. Here he breaks down and explains the idea behind the funding of Israel and the nature of what he too called the apartheid state. Let's take a listen in.
My Jewish values teach me to oppose apartheid. So for me, my politics are built on a base of, economic justice and actually really like anti-racism, as in some ways as distinct from some of this sort of woke stuff in a way. But in 2006, I believe, I read a piece by a guy named Tony Judt in the New York Review of Books, who was a really important Jewish scholar. And he just said, the argument was that literally this is childish. Like the idea that you have an ethno-state or a religious state, if you're committed to any type of broad-based social, economic equity and civil society, it doesn't work. No matter how justified, right? Of course there's justification because of Jewish history for Israel. There's justification for Kurdistan because of Kurdish reality. There's justification for Pakistan. It's notable that Israel and Pakistan are both disasters. Israel not in the sense of, look, if you're a European Jewish background, you have a nice life there. If you're not, you are, even inside 67 borders, not a fully equal citizen. And the situation in the West Bank is, it is literally Jim Crow-like, and Gaza is, it's just an atrocity. So that's not something that anybody could reasonably ask me to support. Yeah, there's some actions from some Palestinian groups that, we can condemn. In fact, those have not even really been in any way seriously in play since 2003. And the apartheid word specifically is both used by people who were crucial in ending apartheid in South Africa, like Desmond Tutu or Ronnie Kasrils, who served as intelligence minister under Mbeki, who I've interviewed. And the other main people who use the apartheid word are Ehud Olmert and Ehud Barak. So it is what it is. And I don't support second-class citizenship and occupation and sieges for anybody, no matter who they are.
Now, one of the major pushbacks that I have gotten, even with my mild approach to the conflict, and I'm categorizing my own response to it as mild, but even with my mild criticisms of what Israel is doing, one of the number one pushbacks that I've gotten has been, Ben, you don't understand it. It's too complicated. You don't know what you're talking about. Now, never mind my credentials. Setting that aside, I want to play this next clip from my friend Michael Brooks. Rest in peace, Michael. Because he made it really clear. It's not complicated. In fact, what we're seeing right now is so far from, it's very simple. The fact that children are being killed, the fact that women are being killed, and the fact that all of the casualties are happening on one side of the equation, no matter how much the mainstream media attempts to make you fear the many rockets that are being shot by Hamas, they're trying to make it seem like it is an equal war. It's not. It is asymmetrical. And Michael Brooks broke that down brilliantly a year ago. Let's take a listen in.
Are you not concerned about the binary between either condemning Israel entirely, being also a stance that a lot of very strong and notorious anti-Semitic people agree with, versus seeing this as more of a complex issue where it is wrong what's going on, and that there's also a way to do this, that Israel still exists and is supported?
So it's not a complex issue. That's the big thing. It's super simple. There's one group that has enormous power. It's the most powerful country in the Middle East. It's backed by the United States. It acts on another population of people with total impunity and is never held accountable for anything. So there's no symmetry in the relationship, period. And just as a thought experiment, IDW people, if we know that if somehow a population of Jewish refugees ended up in West Bank and Gaza, and an Arabic government in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv had an open-air prison in Jewish Gaza, which they bombed with white phosphorus, they killed civilians indiscriminately, and they had no provisions for medicine. They had an embargo that blocked food, that the electricity wasn't running, that there was an over 48% unemployment rate, life expectancy and malnutrition statistics were horrifying. One of the major policymakers in this hypothetical Arabic Palestinian state said, we need to put those Jews on a diet. In the West Bank, there was another Jewish area where there was a little bit more autonomy, but there was regular Arabic settlements where they pulled up the Jewish farmers' foods, they terrorized them with rocks, the security forces broke children's bones, and they couldn't drive on their own roads. We'd all have no problem understanding what that was. So there's nothing complex about it. The second part of your question, it's a pure asymmetry relationship. And the question is rights or not. So that's it. It's not complicated, particularly in the United States. If you work around most people who are concerned with this issue, it's actually populated with a lot of Jewish people. The real question we have to ask is, why is it that AIPAC is hosting an information minister for Slobodan Milosevic? Why is it that there's relationships between the Israeli government and far-right parties in Europe? Why is it that Benjamin Netanyahu's son is posting borderline alt-right memes? Why is it that Israel is an alt-right state, even though it is from the descendants of the victims of one of the greatest crimes in history? That's a serious question, and that's inseparable from the racism of the project, which goes back to the first part that we have to solve. But thank you. Shalom.
Now, I want us to honestly take into consideration what the situation is actually like to live in these environments. Last week, Ria Aslana posted clips to Twitter of an Israeli police force raiding a Palestinian home, attacking the family, and what appears to be them taking some individuals into custody. We're going to show some parts of that, and I want to give you a warning. What follows has violence and may be triggering and disturbing, but I think it's important for people to understand that this is just one part of what's happening on a regular basis in this conflict. Take a look in.
يا ربي
لما انت متكلم لما انت متكلم انا شايف انا شايف
يا رب الله يحميكم الله يحميكم الله يحميكم عباد يش له سكرت يش له سكرت
تعال شوي
Now, again, I do apologize for the nature of that video, but I think it's important for everyone to understand that this is the living conditions. Now, what you're seeing, what you just saw, isn't new. What is new in this cycle, because it is cyclical, is that there are now 197 people who are dead. That includes 58 children and 34 women. And it's important for everyone to understand the nature of what's going on, because on purpose, there is an intentional effort to make it seem as though the victimizers are the victims. But the evidence shows us completely otherwise. There's also an effort to ensure that we look at the Palestinian people through the lens of a threat to Israel, when the reality of what you see for yourself is otherwise. And then there's a concerted effort to make sure that anyone who discusses it is dismissed because of the complexity of the situation, when the reality is otherwise. It is not complex. It is powerful people who are now using that power to harm another group of people. But there's something else that's different about what's happening right now. And that is the vocal nature with which so many people are now speaking out. We played earlier the clip from the squad. And for the first time in my lifetime, we have seen sitting members of Congress speak out boldly on behalf of the Palestinian people. And we're also seeing across the country right now, and quite frankly, across the world, but particularly here in the United States, we're seeing massive protests in support of the Palestinian people. I want us to take a look really quickly at this clip, a protest over the weekend that occurred in Chicago, where thousands of people responded and stood with Palestine. Take a look.
Palestine! Long live Palestine! Long live Palestine! What do we want? What do we want? What do we want? What do we want? When do we want it? 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 When do we want it?
One final difference regarding this conversation today, as opposed to any other year, is the ability of average Americans to know the difference between the right-wing government that is currently in charge of the Israeli government in the form of Benjamin Netanyahu versus the Jewish people or the Jewish faith. Because for so many years, any criticisms of this far right-wing government has been intentionally conflated with anti-Semitism. In other words, for many, many years, it has been extremely difficult for anyone to be able to speak on behalf of the Palestinian people and to speak against the oppression that they face as a result of the government of Israel. It was difficult because all of the spin masters made sure that anyone who spoke against the right-wing government of Benjamin Netanyahu was considered and labeled to be anti-Semitic. But that's not working this time. This time, people are very careful and very clear as it pertains to the differences between a government, a political entity that has power, that has weapons, that has nukes, that has jets, and has the ability to carry out airstrikes, and the Jewish people and the Jewish faith, and able to recognize the fact that anti-Semitism is real. But that is not what is happening right now. And able to recognize that the Palestinian people are Semites as well. But I digress. That's a whole different conversation. The point is that the narrative has been shifting because of diligent work of activists and protesters for years. And now we're finally seeing in the national conversation the reality of the plight of the Palestinian people, as well as the clear differences between the far-right fascistic government of Benjamin Netanyahu and the way that he is using this to wag the dog because he is unable to form a coalition to run the government. And so this entire conflict comes on the heels of him needing to put together a coalition to form a ruling government there in Israel. And the fact that what they are doing is destructive and murderous and oppressive to the Palestinian people. I want to leave with this clip before we go to a break. This is a clip of stand-up comedian and Palestinian American Sami Obied. And he has found his own way of educating people with regard to this issue. Let's take a look at this.
I'm 3/4 Arab, but with a beard I look 4/3 Arab. You know what I mean? Now that you guys like me, I'll go ahead and say it. I'm Palestinian American. Shoot, damn! You booked me! I'm a very proud Palestinian, but I'm your friend. You know what I mean? I put the pal in Palestinian. What? So you're getting weirded out. That's fine. My great-grandma was born in Bethlehem. I tell people this like, oh, Bethlehem, Pennsylvania? I'm like, yeah, that's the one, for sure, dude. She was Amish. No, it's the Bethlehem. Everybody knows that Jesus is from Bethlehem, right? But most people can't point it out on a map. It's a very complicated geopolitical question and answer. Fair enough. My niece asked me last Christmas. She's 5 years old. Where's Bethlehem? I gave her the simplest answer you could, a 5-year-old. I said, well, technically it's in Palestine. But America, we don't recognize Palestine as a country, so technically it's in the Palestinian territories, specifically the West Bank, not the Gaza Strip. It was part of Israel, but they handed over the Palestinian National Authority in 1995 under the interim agreement of Sub 25, Section 2, UN resolution. Of course, before that, part of British Mandate Palestine, of course, before that, part of the Ottoman Empire. You could argue that it still is in Israel technically, of course, because Israel technically occupies the West Bank, but Israel, of course, would say that is not the truth, because that is against international law under many counts. Don't tell the UN, JK, they already know. It's really very complicated, but Jesus is from there. Merry Christmas. So that was the simplest answer I gave her. 45 seconds, I tried my best, and then she's like, well, is Santa Claus real? I'm like, 100% Santa Claus is real. Are you kidding me? She's like, what are you getting me for Christmas? I gave you the gift of Palestine. What more do you want? Like, people pay to see my shows. I gave it to you free of charge. She's like, free Palestine? I was like, exactly. You know how hard it is to do that joke in front of this crowd? I just did it because I'm your pal. I'm your pal. I love you. Work together to bring peace and the end of hatred all across the world. All across the world.